Hello, Emory Baptist. Welcome to Sunday School for Sunday, August 30th. And we'll be looking at session 13 from the Explore the Bible series from the book of Song of Songs. And we'll be reading out of Song of Songs chapter 5 in just a little bit from the Christian Standard Bible. And the title of today's lesson is Relational Investment. Many years ago when I was in high school, I had a 1972 Chevy pickup, and I drove that thing everywhere. That was my vehicle. My dad gave that to me when I turned 16, and I drove it for a couple of years actually. And then I blew the motor on it because I didn't take care of it very well, and we began to look for other vehicles that I might use instead rather than having to replace the motor on an old 72 Chevy. But as we looked at for used cars that my parents might purchase for me to use, we came to the conclusion, or rather they came to the conclusion, that we had already invested a lot of money in that vehicle. It actually had a lot of worth to it, and it would actually cost us a lot more to turn to some other vehicle and start over with something that we're not even sure the history of that vehicle, to see if that would be a good use or a good vehicle for me to have. And so ultimately, my parents, we all decided that it would be better just to fix the vehicle that we had for 20 plus years, just because we knew where it was, we knew where it came from, we knew the value that was still there. And so as we think about that, I hate to compare marriage and friendship and relationships to an old 72 Chevy, but it's kind of what I thought of, because a lot of times in our society, we live in a culture that's really eager to toss away something that doesn't seem to be working, whenever there's a lot of truth to holding on to, a lot of value in holding on to things and putting in some work to make them valuable again. We're looking, of course, at Song of Songs, which is a poem by Solomon, and a song actually by Solomon about a love story between a man and a woman. And we are here in chapter 5 looking at Solomon's wife, the Shulamite. She is, in this part of the poem, crying out and calling out for her husband. In fact, she says in chapter 5, verse 6 through 8, she says, "I opened to my lover, but he was gone. My heart sank. I searched for him, but could not find him anywhere. I called to him, but there was no reply. The night watchmen found me as they made their rounds. They beat and bruised me and stripped off my veil. Those watchmen on the walls, make this promise, O women of Jerusalem. If you find my lover, tell him I am weak with love." And so right here we have this picture of her describing another dream. We looked last week at a dream that she had in chapter 2 and about how it came together and what she was envisioning in chapters 2 and 3 about her life before she got married. She was dreaming about her fiance, and now we're looking at her dreaming about her husband. She's describing a dream she had about her husband in that he wasn't there. Of course, with imagery, it could be that he probably physically could have been there, but just was distant from her. Or you probably know Solomon had several wives throughout his life, and so it might have been a description of her when he wasn't physically present with her. She's describing the ache that she has in not having her husband there, that he's somewhere else. And so she describes in this dream that he's not there for her, and that she goes to look for him. And this time when she goes, those guards from the first dream who found her and prevented her from going to her fiance at the time, they did her good last time, but this time they're preventing her from going to her husband. And when they do that, it actually does her harm. She is in this marriage already, and that she should have this relational connection with her husband, that she is free to go to them, but for some reason she is prevented. And she sees that as harm. And so you see the difference between those two encounters, those two dreams. The guard stopped her the first time, which was the right thing, and the guard stopped her the second time, which she had kind of described as abuse, right? That it was the wrong thing, that they had removed her covering. which was a description or a picture of the marital symbol that a husband covers his wife. And so whenever they prevented her from going to her husband, they removed the covering over her and the protection over her. And so as we look at this, we see there should be no barriers between the husband and the wife, that there's no need for emotional distance. There should be an emotional connectedness between a husband and wife, and there should be spiritual connectedness as well, as they converse with each other in the same language. Whenever we talk about the same language, I tend to think of the 5 love languages and the ways that husbands and wives speak to each other, ways that people speak to each other in doing things for each other, and speaking kind words, and spending time together. However you feel valued and loved, that's an important way to make sure they feel valued and loved. There's an old movie, actually play, called Fiddler on the Roof many years ago. And there's a scene in which Tevier goes to his wife, this woman that they had an arranged marriage, and so they were married before really they even knew each other very well. And he has this question. He says, "Do you love me?" And as she contemplates what it means, does she love him? She lists the things. She says, "I've washed his clothes, I've cleaned his house, I've given him children, I've milked his cow, I've lived with him, I've fought with him, I've starved with him." And ultimately she concludes, if that isn't love, what is, right? And so that picture that a lot of times, he was having trouble knowing, does he love her? And all the things that she was doing was saying and showing that she loved him. And so being able to recognize your spouse's love language and the way they demonstrate and show love is an important thing, as well as making sure they understand how you show love, and listening to them and how they would prefer to be loved. And so any relationship, you have to have, someone needs to know that you value them, that you are important, right? Or that they are important to you. And so all relationships are based on that. To have someone who makes time to be with you, and someone who listens to your joys and your concerns, and someone who comforts you in times of grief or in times of trouble. I remember whenever my grandmother passed away, my father was the one that had found her there, and as my mom had gathered us children and driven into Garland, as soon as we got there, my dad came out of my grandparents' house and came and just hugged my mother and just hugged for a little bit, hugged for actually a good long while, and you could see together in that moment their relationship, that they had been there for each other and that they would be there for each other. And it made a big impact on me, watching my parents connect emotionally like that, to be with each other there for each other. And so part of God's design for humanity is that we would be relational beings, and when we are relational beings, we overcome that selfishness that is part of the brokenness of humanity. Rather than focusing on ourselves, when we begin to focus on others, we reflect God's creation, that relational connectedness in us that he designed in us. And so Paul actually addresses this in the book of Romans. He talks about rejoicing with those who rejoice and weeping with those who weep, about loving God, and then as a part of loving God, loving people. That's an outworking, a demonstration. Whenever we are able to love people because of our love for God, that's a demonstration of God's working in us. And so there's this spiritual truth that's discovered even a lot of times by the secular world, that the happiest people are the ones who are actually others-centered. There was a poet many years ago named Walter Scott, and he wrote this. He wrote, "The wretch, concentered all in self, living shall forfeit fair renown, and doubly dying shall go down to the vile dust from whence he sprung, unwept, unhonored, and unsung." In other words, the picture there is a guy who spends all of his life focused on himself will eventually die and be irrelevant, and it will not matter to anyone. But God didn't design us that way. God designed us for relationship. And so as we look in Song of Songs, chapter 5, verse 9, we see this call for remembering, that as the young woman calls out for the young women as the Shulamite calls out for the young women to look for her husband and to call her husband and to bring her husband back, tell her that she's looking for him, they answer her and they say, "Why is your lover better than all others? O woman of rare beauty, what makes your lover so special that we must promise this?" And what you see here is whenever the young women come in, it's actually just a reflection of what is right. There's this calling out of a society of what's important and what matters. And so before we've seen them call out, the young woman call out to the young women, and she calls out and says, "Do not awaken love," which is do not awaken love before it so desires, which is a collective reminder of agreed morality and of spiritual authority over her and over them and over their society. And it's a declaration of her belief in God's word and declaration of her belief in God and his plan for his people. And so it's actually this call out to a reflective community. And as she calls out to this reflective community to watch for her husband, the answer that comes back is, why should we watch for him? And maybe a little bit surprising for us to read that, especially in our present cultural climate, where if the person that you're with doesn't make you happy, then you should just leave them, right? A lot of times that's what we hear, that we have these emotional appeals that if he doesn't make you happy, well, you should leave him. Or if she has offended you, then you should just leave her. But instead we see her calling out to the reflective community and answering this question that comes back, why should we love him? Why should we tell him that you're looking for him, that this relationship is important? And she's actually recalling back. They're calling her, the reflective community is calling for her to think back to her marriage vows. Those of you who are married may remember your marriage vows, and if not, you've probably heard some marriage vows as you've attended the weddings of others. But at some point in the wedding, the person presiding over the wedding will say, "Do you take this person for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death do you part, so help you God?" And it would be weird for someone to answer back, yes, no, yes, yes, and maybe, right? That's not what we're looking for. We want someone who's going to say, yes, I will be there in the midst of all of those circumstances, not picking and choosing which ones I like and don't like. And so the question actually comes back, not is he worthy, but the question comes back, are you willing? Are you looking? Are you committed to this relationship? To be honest with you, if we ask the question, is he worthy of your time and interest and investment? A lot of women would say, no, really, he's not, right? He may not even be good enough. But the deal is, what they're calling her back to is remember that God is worthy. That God is worthy of your pledge to commit yourself to that failing person. To that person who is still suffering from the consequences suffering from the stain and the sickness of sin, but is still working himself out or working ourselves out to love better and to be more obedient to Christ. And so the question is that's brought back is not is he worthy, but is God worthy of the commitment that you've made to love your spouse in sickness and in health and in all those things. Lacey and I have a running joke in our marriage that whenever we say I love you and the question the other person asks, well, why do you love me? The answer to that question is because you don't ask stupid questions. And the reason we say that is because if love is based on whatever response we give, if I say, why do you love me? And she says, well, you are intelligent and you're good looking and all those things. The moment that I cease to be those things, her love for me could come into question. But if I say, why do you love me? And she says, because you don't ask stupid questions, what that means is I love you because I love you, right? There's not a quantifiable thing there, but I love you because I choose to love you. And so it's not based on something that I've got to do to keep being loved, but it's based on her commitment to the Lord and her love for me. And it's the same with me, my commitment to the Lord and my continued love towards her. And so it says in Song of Songs chapter 5, verses 10 through 16, there's this, the crux of celebrating. What are we celebrating here? And it says in verse 10, my love is fit and strong, notable among 10,000. His head is purest gold. His hair is wavy and black as a raven. His eyes are like doves beside flowing streams, washed in milk and set like jewels. His cheeks are like beds of spice, mounds of perfume. His lips are lilies dripping with flowing myrrh. His arms are rods of gold set with beryl. His body is an ivory panel covered with lapis lazuli. His legs are alabaster pillars set on pedestals of pure gold. His presence is like Lebanon, as majestic as the cedars. His mouth is sweetness. He is absolutely desirable. This is my love, and this is my friend, young women of Jerusalem. As you read that description, sometimes, it's difficult for us to really get that. There's a lot of figurative language there. There's a ton of figurative language there, a lot of similes and metaphors, comparisons that maybe don't make a lot of sense. If you call your husband today, if you say he's like Lebanon, a bunch of trees, that might not be considered a compliment, and there's some places here we may not totally get. If you call your husband washed in milk, he'll go, all right, I don't know what that means, but okay. But to be sure, here's what's happening. She is describing him, as she is describing a physically handsome man. She's calling out his features, and she's saying that these features are handsome, but these are not things that she appreciates about him to make her love him, but rather these are things that she appreciates about the one she already loves. And so that's the difference here, that she is remembering and recalling the things that she loves about him, but she loves him first, right? Love and commitment come first. And so there's this encouragement. They say, what is good about him? And she remembers the one she loves, and she begins to call out the things about him that she appreciates. In other words, first of all, she looks for and remembers the good qualities. As you're looking at your marriage, as you're recalling those marriage vows, the temptation is to look at all the bad stuff and say, this is not worth it anymore. This guy's not fulfilling what he's supposed to do. Guys say, this is not worth it anymore. She's not the person that I fell in love with. She doesn't look the same. She doesn't act the same. We're at a different place, and I don't appreciate this now. What we're seeing here is that they're saying, all right, what's valuable? And she, instead of turning to the things that hurt her, she turns and says, these are the things that I appreciate. And she begins to say, pull up these things that she appreciates, this encouragement to find good qualities in him. And she begins to describe him. And as you are married to that person becomes your standard of beauty, which means that sometimes grace is necessary to overlook the flaws. That sometimes, she describes this man of hers as fit and strong with wavy black hair, but maybe later she'll describe him as relatively in good shape and having wiry gray hair, or perhaps a fine monument to where hair used to be, right? There's still opportunities to appreciate, even if that person has changed, looking for those things, those qualities, those characteristics that you can love, and those characteristics that you can appreciate. But I love that the very end of it here, there's the capstone of it, this description of this really handsome guy, but then the description of it is that she says, this is the one I love, and this is my friend. There's this friendship that above all else, they've invested in a genuine relationship together. And so in all these other relationships that you have, this husband and wife, you see the importance of valuing that relationship that you have, but this is the same that you would find in a friendship, that you value, you take time to value and find what you value in the other person, that you can, it's really easy to be a critic. It is super easy to find flaws in someone else, but instead, the purpose of relationship is that we would learn to appreciate more. A lot of times I talk to my boys whenever they're fighting with each other, with others, and I look at them and say, look, the problem right now that you have is you have really high expectations of what you expect for other people to do for you, and really low expectations of what you feel like you need to give to someone else. And really that's creating for you a lot of problems. That's creating frustration for you. Instead, why don't you do this? Why don't you learn to have a high appreciation of others? That you look for the good characteristics and good qualities in them, and you value those things, and you learn to look at those things in remembering and referencing them. And then you begin to have this low demand. You begin to demand less for yourself. Demand that they jump through very many hoops for you. And you'll begin to appreciate the things that they do for you. And you'll begin to appreciate who they are. And your relationship will grow, which will actually bring you more joy in your life. And so as we look at this passage, we have some summarizing statements here that come out of the Daily Discipleship Guide, page 104, if you're in the Daily Discipleship Guide, or if you're studying the Personal Study Guide, it's probably on page 117. But it talks about godly marriages that should be characterized by mutual, moral, and emotional support. That's what that first part talks about, is that godly marriages are characterized by mutual support, that you're there for each other and you're there with each other. And number two, the second part talks about godly marriages are founded on commitment to remain faithful to each other throughout life, to remember, to recall back those vows that you made in marriage. And then number three, godly marriages include mutual affirmation of one's spouse, to look for those good qualities and to call those out and to appreciate those yourself. And so let me give you a few contemplation questions as we close here. Number one, how can you provide support for people who are experiencing abuse or who have experienced abuse? Because we certainly don't want someone to live in a marriage or continue in a marriage where they're experiencing physical abuse, emotional abuse. So in our support for marriage, we do want to remember that there is a need for right relationships, right interactions in marriage. And so if you know someone who's in abuse, we definitely need to call that out for the sake of the person that is suffering. And so how can you provide support for people who have experienced that or are experiencing that? Number two, why do people seek relationships, and what role does God play in our need for relationships? And number three, if you are married, determine one action that you will take this week to affirm your wife or your husband. Or if you're single, determine one way of strengthening your friendships and personal investment. Let me pray for us, and then we'll move on with the rest of our day. Jesus, I love you. Thank you for, God, this word, this reminder, God, for those of us in marriage, that we should remind ourselves of our commitment to you. And as we are committed to you, God, that we would remain committed to our spouses, to be there, to be more than just physically present, but to be emotionally, spiritually there for each other. And Father, I pray for those that are not married. I pray that you would just bless them, God, as they have various friendships, that you've designed us for a relationship and that you've designed us to be interactive in other people's lives. And so, Father, help us to think about how we can live our lives to love people the way that you love people. And Father, I pray that you'd help us to listen to you. God, be with us as we move on with the rest of our day. I love you, Jesus. In your name I pray. Amen.